I will keep
Okay, let's start that.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good. Okay. Everybody sleepy after lunch, maybe? Very sleepy too. I make exciting lecture. Keep you on your toes. So first question is, who was not here the first two sessions? First time in this class? Just the one person? Okay. Everyone else knows the deal. You can get the textbook. I mean, I will start uploading the notes for the classes on Classes. I don't know if it starts next week. I think after Golden Week. Very slow. I don't know why it takes so long, but please wait until then. The textbook is this one, as you know. If you borrowed it last week, most of you brought it back. Please bring it back. There's one more copy you can borrow. Okay, we read chapter 13, 14, and next week we read 15. Has everybody been able to get a copy or go to the library and copy? Yeah? Please read it. Yeah? Who has not been able to read? Who admits to not having read the chapter? Nobody admits. Okay. Well, just read it. And as I said, there's a Japanese version of this Honyakuban. So you can read that and the English. And we'll improve your English, improve your Japanese. Pretty useful. Okay, so last week we talked about the U.S. occupation of Japan and the occupation policy of demilitarization, organization, all these different changes that they tried to put in place. Also a little bit about the reverse course, trying to understand what's kind of the framework of the sort of set the course of the rest of the post-war period in many ways, and especially created stability but also created tension. And that's very important to understand that. Of course, after the war, Japan was ravaged and there was all kinds of things up in the air, but through this very, very extensive program during the occupation, a lot of things were settled. Land reform, creating a new constitution, the peace clause in the constitution, signing the U.S.-Japan peace treaty, and also the security treaty, all these things. Later on, as we'll see in this class and upcoming class, have great impact in terms of creating stability, but also creating different kind of tensions within the groups in Japan, and also between Japan and the rest of the world. Today we focus mainly on the economy, okay? And we talked about this thing called the economic miracle. In Japanese it's called the Kodo Seichoki, so high growth era. Oftentimes in English literature, or I don't know, maybe German or French, they refer to this period between 1955 and about 72, primarily, as a post-war miracle. I don't know if they use the word kiseki, but miracle is a very strange term to use in historical analysis. What is a miracle? Kiseki, right? Why does a miracle happen? What's the cause of miracles? Anybody? Give it a try? Yes?
It's just a super improbable event that just happens to happen.
Super improbable. What's super improbable? What's improbable in easy English?
Like it's very unlikely to happen.
Very unlikely. Very rare. Happened. That somehow happened. So the idea is, well, this period of economic growth and stability in Japan is very, very rare. Is that true? First of all, is that really true historically? You can question that. And also, if you start saying something is a miracle, it's not clear what causes it, right? Maybe it's God. Oftentimes, miracle is linked to religion. The miracle of, I don't know, creation, the miracle of birth, or virgin birth, the miracle of whatever religion you believe in. There are all kinds of miracles. Basically stuff that you cannot explain. As a historian, is that okay? Or as a social scientist? No. You want to try and explain things. So trying to understand this period, well, the first thing you have to try to get to grips is what sort of reasons or arguments can you give to explain why this happened? And is it just Japan, or are there other countries that experience this kind of high growth for a long time? And we'll discuss the different kinds of historical forces, like we talked in the first class, that may have been responsible, that is argued to be responsible for this supposed miracle. If you can explain something, it's not really a miracle, is it? It's understandable. Or maybe it's understandable, it's a miracle in that it's very rare combination of events happening at the same time. You can explain it, but it's a very rare situation. That you could argue. Another thing we want to talk about is not just why, or how this happened, but what were its effects. What were effects of a situation for 2 decades the economy grows at 10%, right? And industrialization, urbanization happens at such a rapid pace. What sort of results, good or bad, occur? And how does that feed into the next period? How does that affect politics, which we'll talk about next week? Okay, so it's a kind of twin session. We talk about 1955 to 72, economy today, and then next week is Golden Week. Oh, you're free. So you don't have to think about post-war politics for a long time. 2 weeks later, we talk about the political conflicts of this period. Okay, so that's chapter 50. Okay, is that generally clear? Yeah. No big complicated ideas here. No. Just a moment, please. Okay. So what kind of themes do we have? These kind of things we talked about. What caused the high growth? Was it a miracle? Was it planned? What parts of it were planned? What parts of it were a result of conscious decisions by politicians or bureaucrats or company owners or management or even individuals? And what part of it was just a result of other factors, especially outside of Japan, that weren't really a result of the Japanese themselves or those involved in Japan making decisions? How did it alter Japan? And another question is, we talk about high growth. It seems like a wonderful thing, and we have a very simplistic view is that it was a great time. Everybody benefited. Japan recovered from the ashes of disaster of World War II, and it became this world economy, and everybody was getting better incomes, and everybody was buying their color TVs and their air conditioners and their cars. Sanshino Jinki. And that's a very simplistic version. The reality is that some groups did not do so well, or worse than others. In whatever period of, it looks like, whatever figure, even if you see GDP 10% growth, there will always be groups or individuals who lose out. One has to be always conscious of that, okay? Even when you see, in recent times, there's discussion under Abenomics, economy is growing, GDP growth is growing, average income is growing, but that's average, that's the macro picture. If you look more carefully, you disaggregate, you break it down into different groups. You see that some people or some groups are doing better, some companies are doing better. In net, it might be getting better. So trying to understand the net picture and the micro picture together is important. And then the tensions. So we have these 4 sections. What exactly does the economic miracle constitute? How can we measure it? What were the causes that are often discussed in the book and in other literature? How did it impact Japan, society-wise? And then which groups were benefiting, or which groups were the main drivers, which groups were kind of left out? And then this will, of course, lead into next week's discussion of the kind of fighting conflicts that took place, because the 50s to the 70s is very interesting. It's high growth, but also high tension, high conflict. You have, Anpo Toso, you have the security protests, you have student protests, activists, you have environmental protests, labor union strikes, all sorts of conflict. So you think, if the economy is growing, usually everybody will be happy. There'll be less conflict, as opposed to a period when the economy is slowing down. But if you compare 1990s to 2010, when Japanese economy was 0% growth, 1%, 2%, even minus, this period 10%, the amount of political instability and conflict much higher in this period. We can also start thinking about what's the connection between economic growth, rapid economic growth, and political stability. Okay? It's a very big theme, not just in Japan, but say China, or I don't know, Eastern Europe, anywhere, Brazil, countries that have this rapid growth, 10%. Over 2 decades, what happens to the society and politics? Okay. It's called the high growth era. Mainly it's between 1952 72, where the GDP growth was averaged between 10%, 7, 8, 12, 13%. Why 1952? Well, 1952 is the beginning of end of the occupation. Also, the second year into the Korean War, which we talked about a little bit last week, which triggered, as one student said, one of the reasons why Japan set up its own national police force, which eventually became the self-defense force. Americans had to be deployed to Korean Peninsula, so Japan was naked, and they needed some rearming, which the US said, Japan, please rearm because we won't be able to protect you. We're going to be in Korea. Anyhow, that's the beginning. 72. Why does it end at 72? What happens in 1972, 73? Who knows? Yes, ma'am.
Oil crisis.
Oil crisis, yes. So it's bookended by an oil crisis, where GDP growth basically falls off, picks up very quickly. Major crisis. When you compare to other countries, Japan had only 6% in 55, which Japan's economy was only 6% of the United States. By 1975, it was a third of the U.S. So you can see how big it was, how big it has become. It became the third world's largest economy, overtaking UK, France, and Germany by 1975. So very quick. So it was maybe, I don't know, 1950s, the economic size, I'm not sure, 7, 8, 10. It's still a pretty big economy. But by then, it had overtaken all these European powers. So US, Soviet Union, and then Japan. Exports increase exponentially. One of the main drivers of Japan's growth was export driven. And it, huge, astonishing figures, 25%, 25 times growth, 6% of global trade, so some figures. And in many industries, heavy industries, shipbuilding, steel, chemicals, plastic, these heavy, big machinery, big industries, Japan becomes number 1 or number 2 in terms of production output. Nowadays, of course, these kind of industries, Japan, it doesn't have so much of a presence, but at that time, very big. And then by the end of the 60s, 70s, beginning of 70s, more value-added industries, electronics, cars, they start to form. They're still not the biggest earners, but they start to become important. That's just the GDP growth, real GDP, so adjusted for inflation. 1955 to 70, you can see, average between 8 to 12%, to 10%. And then 72, boom, oil shock. Picks up quite quickly. And then, of course, it slows down about 5%, which is pretty healthy. And then by the 1990s, 89, it goes under 2%, 0%. This is the bubble period. And then Ushinada, 2 decades, very, very flat. It's picked up a little bit, but very weak. Industrialization industry becomes a big part of the economy. Agriculture, of course, becomes much, much smaller. Number of people working in agriculture shrink very quickly. So in this 25-year period, the number of farmers was 40% of the population working force, not population working labor force, and then fell to 12%. And then by now it's 1-2% of Sengyonoka, so those who work full time as farmers. This is very quick. What's important is that it's a steep fall, but it's also a very quick fall. If one compares to other countries that industrialized, UK, France, Germany, they take much longer. Japan goes through this very rapidly. All right. Shipbuilding, steel production, all these kind of things, Japan overtakes very quickly. Steel is very important for modern industry. Very, very important. It's like the engine of industrial growth. And Japan's steel makers, you can see here, production in tons. This here, red is China. Japan is what? This black one here. But, you know, from about the 1950s here, it's 1950, this is 2010, very, very rapid rise, catching up with the US and Soviet Union. An important thing about Japanese steel is that very high quality. So Soviet Union, China, they have lots of steel production, but it doesn't have the kind of very high quality fine steel Japan makes, which is used for all sorts of things. Obviously for construction, for shipbuilding, for cars, various things. China, about the 1990s, straight off the charts. Well, of course, the statistics from China and Soviet Union you can't really trust as much. Okay, that's the side of the industry, the producers, the suppliers. How about the consumers? Consumers, of course, are getting wealthier. Their incomes are growing. Their per capita GDP, that is, the amount of money that each individual, if you divide the GDP, of course, the GDP is growing, so per capita GDP is growing. It more than increases by 10 times, right? It was about 100,000 yen in 1965, so 1.2 million yen in 1974. Right now, GDP per capita in Japan is what? Who knows? Hitori atari GDP.
30,000.
Yeah, it's about 300 or something. Yeah?
Is this accounting for inflation?
I'm not sure.
It should be. If
Prob-
not, it doesn't mean anything.
Probably is a figure that includes, is a real figure. But anyhow, large jump. Incomes, spending also increasing very rapidly. Often talked about in Japanese textbooks and popular descriptions of the period is this Sanshu no Jinki, the 3 C's. So consumer goods, what are they? They're the TV, the refrigerator, and the washing machine. So mass consumer goods, about the 50s, this is what everybody wanted, and ownership goes out. Ownership spreads very quickly. And then the second round of consumer goods is color TV, car, and air conditioner. I guess this is in the 60s, 64 when the Olympics happened. Everybody wanted to watch the Olympics and color TV. All these kind of modern consumer goods, which most was a very luxury, most people didn't own by this time. Most everybody owns. I have a picture of this Sanshu no Jinki growth. So, I'm sorry this is in Japanese, but these items, very classic looking things, but this was what everybody wanted, more than anything. And, ownership, this is ownership by family, by household, I guess? Yeah, by household, most of the things become 100%. These are the latest. Digital TV, flat TV, dishwasher. I don't know if those are things. Okay. Exports, high growth driven by domestic demand, exports increase. So they often talk about exports being the main driver of Japanese post-war growth. It was important, but it was not the only important thing. What was important was that there was very strong domestic demand. Naiju. That was one of the main reasons why a lot of these electronic consumer goods companies could sell in Japan, because there was a lot of demand for stuff. After the war, everybody wanted to have stuff. They're free to buy stuff. Before the war or ended, everybody was forced to sacrifice. You're not supposed to buy stuff. Now it was okay, it was accepted. And people were wealthier. So the internal demand, people's salaries were increasing, and there were all these new goods people wanted to buy. New households being formed, young families, so there's a lot of demand internally. Today it's the reverse situation. Japan has a problem of not having enough naiju, not having enough domestic demand. One reason may be that people have most of the things they need. Possibly you can argue that. Another is that people don't have enough extra income. People are worried about the future, so they save instead. GDP per person, so it's important. Was this period of GDP growth, high performance, was this unique to Japan? Well, this chart comes from the World Bank, Cabinet Office indicators. If you compare China and Japan and Korea, China starting at 78 to 2003, Korea, South Korea from 62 to 87, Japan 51 to 76. Quite similar, very similar actual growth trajectory. Okay. So Korea had also an economic miracle. China also had an economic miracle. Probably countries like Taiwan, yeah, Brazil, Malaysia, maybe where else would have experienced? Brazil, India also, very, very high growth, 7, 8, 10%. So is Japan a miracle in the sense that it's very, very rare? No, I won't say that. In terms of just the simple measure of high GDP growth for 10 years or 20 years. Of course, you could say Japan's situation was different and that other things make it different, miraculous than the others. But one should remember, it wasn't only just Japan, obviously, that has this kind of stuff. But Japan was maybe the first. South Korea, Taiwan, China, India, Brazil, they came later. Okay, this kind of massively rapid growth. Okay, what were the causes then? Everybody okay to hear? Yeah? What kind of causes can we look at? Well, we have to look at the international context of Japan. Economies are not isolated. Because they trade and because they need raw materials from outside, you have to look at the situation overseas. Especially Japan, because Japan has, well, relatively robust size local domestic economy market, but it depends so much on raw materials and from outside, and also in part exports and also capital investments from outside. We have to look at the rest of the world. Actually, this period was a period of economic boom all over the world. Okay, also like the post-war peace dividend. People are not spending money on wars, governments are not spending money on wars and fighting, which is very costly and damaging. Right? Focus was on rebuilding economies in Europe. In U.S. economy is growing, so most countries 4 to 5% growth. Okay. France, for example, it's called the glorious 30 years. I don't know what's that in French. Glorious 30. Anybody from France? No. Is that called glorious 30?
30 glorious.
30 glorious. So in French, 30 years of glorious growth. Right? And then, of course, it kind of slows down. US 2, UK 2, 50s, 60s, 70s. And then from about mid-70s, things become a bit iffy all over the world. For similar reasons to Japan, oil shock, but other reasons as well. Open markets, at least in the Western camp, which Japan was a member of, strategically, we talked about the Yoshida Doctrine. Japan gets protected by the US militarily, but it trades and it has good relations or strong relations with other Western countries, liberal democracies. There was a lot of open markets, a lot of tariffs were coming down, tariffs, that is, trade barriers were coming down, much more trade, and international currency was stable. This helps trade. And so total volume of international trade in these 20 years triples. That's a big deal. Okay? I'll show you a chart. Last thing is cheap oil, which we tend to not think about. But oil is the engine of modern economies. Without oil, a lot of things don't run. Okay? And if you have cheap oil, tend to have strong growth globally. It's correlated. So apparently, in recent years, this correlation has broken down a bit. This shows, how rapidly. This is global GDP, global trade from the 50s, 60s to 2002. Anyway, upward trajectory. And this was a rising tide. Japan was very well suited to benefit from that rising tide because it was trading with all these other countries. And benefiting from stable currency and also cheap oil. 1860 to 2006, so a very long period. But if you look from about 1950s to 76, the blue line is real oil price, nominal. So yellow is adjusted for inflation. $2,000. could see that oil prices stayed very stable, and then they start shooting up. So oil shock, oil goes up, it slows down economies to some extent. Okay. Other international causes, the security treaty, the other aspect of the Yoshida Doctrine. Japan doesn't have to worry about diplomacy or security, and it relies on the U.S. nuclear umbrella, it relies on U.S. bases. So it doesn't spend much money on the military. In the post-war period, there was an unwritten but generally followed rule of spending only 1% of GDP on the military, on the self-defense force, which you compare to 1940s, 42, 43, 44, before the end of the war, which was about 30 to 60% of GDP spent on military, which is crazy. If you spend so much money on military and then you send it off and it gets destroyed, obviously there's not going to be accumulation of investments in the country, and they won't. It's a kind of money that isn't going to grow. So, if spending on military was like other industrial nations in the post-war period, maybe not like the U.S., but the UK or Germany and France, I don't know, 3-4% of GDP, maybe less. The economy would be 30% smaller. There's some calculations. Obviously, it's not going to be a perfect calculation. It's just some estimates. The fact that Japan didn't spend so much money on the military helped Japan's economy grow. And the yen. This was part of a conscious decision, I would say, to help Japan's economy recover. And in the reverse course, they set this U.S.-Japan currency, U.S. dollar, Japan yen currency exchange rate at 360 yen for $1, and this was set until Nixon shock. What happens when you have a cheap yen? Well, if you're an exporting nation, it's very good because what happens? What's good about the weak yen?
It's cheaper.
It's cheaper. Your products become cheaper and it's competitive. But right now, Trump wants to make the dollar cheaper, right? He says the dollar's too high, and we're going to have to make the other currencies are too cheap. The yuan, the Chinese yuan, is too cheap. China is a currency manipulator, he was saying until 2 weeks ago. He realized he had to deal with North Korea, so let's not get China too angry for one of the reasons. Anyhow, so cheap yen benefits exporters, benefited Japan's economy considerably. So exporters like textiles, steel, shipbuilders, their income, their profits, very much affected by change in yen. Even today, all these companies, depending on the currency rate, they may have a profit this year, they may not have a profit this year. In this period, yen was very stable. It was not floating. So one could say that this helped. Cheap export price, this was an export subsidy for Japan. So these kind of international reasons tied in very closely to the U.S.-Japan security relationship treaty. Okay. How about domestic? This becomes much more complicated. There are many, many more domestic reasons that one can point to. Labor force, the size of the labor force, the quality of the labor force, very important in how effective and how efficient an economy is, how fast it grows, how much demand there is. There was a high proportion of mobile surplus adult labor from rural districts. That was because agriculture was modernizing so quickly. Many farmers, you didn't need so many farmers, young hands working, mechanization. So they could all come to the cities or the factory areas and they provide labor. Okay? Very, very different situation from Japan today. Surplus labor, extra labor. That was put to work in newly built factories and newly built services or newly developing services. Also, the population was growing. There was a baby boom. What's a baby boom? It's when lots of children are born. 1947-49. Why? Why would you have a boom after the war? Aren't you all tired after the war? Why do you want to make babies? Yeah? Anybody? Yes, sir.
You need more workforce.
We need a bigger workforce.
And then the situation how to get better so we can start to achieve it again.
Right. Well, first of all, there's no risk of being bombed, or you're less risk of being bombed, less risk of your children being taken away to to conscription and having to fight silly wars. So maybe parents feel more confidence. Yes?
Sorry, all the soldiers coming back, right?
Huh? Yeah, very good. All the soldiers who were away, all the husbands are coming back. They hadn't seen their wives for a long time, so I guess it's baby making time. And this happens after a lot of crises. They say that there's a little kind of blip. So after the 2011 earthquake, there's all this talk about people getting married, people having more babies. Statistically, some small jump. I'm not sure. Not as big as this thing. So this brought on a steady stream of new workers and also new population which get married and also creates new households. When you make a new household, you have to buy a new house, you have to buy a new TV, you have to buy a new refrigerator, you have to spend a lot of money. That creates more internal demand. It's very important. Also, the quality of the workers, the level of literacy and the level of education in Japan pre-war was quite high, even compared to internationally. And there was also elite bureaucracy and elite white-collar workers who were quite skilled and who had scientists and research R&D capacities from the pre-war period. Of course, they invested a lot after the war, but these were also very useful. They took over organizations, or they started new ones after the old managers were purged. So the 50s, 60s, they were purged, and then you have this young, ambitious, capable guys who had already experienced these companies. They do new things. So there was a kind of clearing out of the top, and then renewal and innovation could be possible. As a result, all highly motivated, experienced white-collar managers from pre-war are taking over. Pent-up material demands and desire for wealth. As I said, in the Imperial Japan, luxury goods, there's even a slogan, 求めません、勝つまでは、買いません、勝つまでは, something like that. Unless we win the war, we're not going to ask for luxury because they're constant wars. So unless all the soldiers come back, we're not going to ask for consumer goods. This, of course, dampens demand for consumer goods. After the war, you don't have this. Everybody's a citizen, free citizen. It was encouraged, I think, to a degree, to pursue material consumption. And this, of course, triggers growth. Educated workforce, we'll get to that a bit later. Birth rates, we'll talk about this a lot more in terms of the later period post-war, but this is very, very steep, rapid drop in total fertility, amount of children people are making. Well, back then when, in the 40s, 70s, there was total fertility rate was 4.2, 4.3, almost triple. So you have families with 3, 4, 5 children, very common back then. Okay? It was very quickly, actually in the 50s, 60s, it goes down quite steeply. But in the beginning, there was a baby boom. Okay, and also longevity. People lived much longer than this comes into later. Population stats in 1950, very young population. It's a pyramid. This is the age group, so 0 to 100. So you have people who are, the majority of people are under 40 or 30. Now the majority of the people are between 40, 30, and 60. And soon the majority of the people will be above 40. 2050, almost soon. This obviously has tremendous impact on economic structure and also growth to some degree. It's not deterministic, but it's an important variable. There are, of course, other economies that have a very large young population and their economies are not going anywhere, right? But such as where? I don't know. Can you name a place where there's a rapidly growing population, the economy isn't moving, or it's not high growth? I don't know. Statistics. Probably some countries in third world countries, I don't know, Central Africa somewhere, or somewhere in South America where there's a very young population. Population is growing, but GDP isn't really, because of other factors. Probably lack of political stability, lack of educated workforce, I don't know, name it. There was a lot of savings. Japanese salaried workers bought a lot, but they also saved a lot because incomes were growing. salaries were doubling every 10 years. And that was the goal. We did not have double salary every 10 years. So, savings for of the Japanese public was very high compared to international standards. 4 to 5 times of the US. What does it do to the general economy when people save a lot? What happens to the savings? Yes, ma'am. They get reinvested, right? You put your money in the bank, you put your back money in the post office, which a lot of people did in Japan. That money is spent elsewhere, hopefully. But this cycle sometimes doesn't work. You have a situation of high savings. Banks have too much money. Postal service, or banks, they have too much money and they don't know where to invest because there's no growth areas. This is a problem. And this was a problem in Japan the last 20, 30 years. Everybody's saving because they're worried about the future, but banks and governments, they don't have effective places to invest. That's a deflationary period. But in this time, there's a lot of demand, there's a lot of need to build up Japan. So all these savings went into new factories, they went into new infrastructure, and it was a positive cycle. Okay? And that expanded the economy, companies got richer, wealthier, they paid more to the workers, and the workers saved money. And they also bought a lot of things domestically. So virtuous cycle. Banks and also, as I said, invest both in large and small corporations. Very simple summary of capital investment benefits or causes of growth. Keiretsu, well, I don't want to talk about this. We talked a little about Zaibatsu, the big conglomerates, family combines that the occupation wanted to break apart, right? They wanted to kaitai. But actually, in reverse course and later, they didn't really push through breaking apart. And these Zaibatsu, they returned, these combines, and they became very effective. And they also evolved into these Keiretsu structures, which I won't talk about because it's beyond this class. But they pushed growth in chemical, shipbuilding, heavy industries, all these things. They're very efficient and effective in winning global share and being competitive globally. And the new kind of cars, electronics, construction and farming, all these industries, there were also new kinds of Keiretsu, new kind of Zaibatsu, new kind of group companies formed. And this was very effective, competitive compared to other styles of companies in other countries. So is argued. All right. The last cause that we can talk about is the state, which people often talk of. Used to be one key argument. Why is Japan's economy so successful in the 50s, 60s? It's because the state, the bureaucrats were so clever. The bureaucrats from Kodai and the bureaucrats from Kyodai, they led Japan very effectively. But this is controversial and has become much more controversial, obviously, after the 1990s when Japan's economy crashed. And state-guided industrial policy seemed to be not working. Controversial in that some people say, no, it's not really. The MITI and the other state agencies, they are not so responsible. Only a small part of the success in the economic miracle we can assign to them. Others would say, yes, it's one of the key things. For example, Chalmers Johnson, scholar, American scholar, great scholar from MIT, I think. He wrote this book called MITI and the Japanese Miracle. What's MITI? Who knows what MITI is? Yes, ma'am.
I don't know the how to say long version. I know the last one is institution, but it was basically an institution to plan and how to induce economic development, innovation. So they kind of basically planned economy.
Yeah.
And
Well,
they
yeah.
promoted
Trade.
innovation and trade.
What's MITI in Japanese? Not METI, but MITI. No? 知らんの? MITI. 日本語で。通産省。経済産業省じゃなくて通産省。Right? Ministry of International Trade and Industry was ministry.
Oh, is that institution?
Ministry. It's a 省庁, right? 通産省. I think that's the Japanese. Sure. Okay. Now it's become Keizai Sangyosho, which is METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. What's their role? Well, their role, as you said, was to guide Japanese industry and to plan and to help big companies, even smaller companies, where to invest, what sort of technologies to invest, what industries to invest, how to trade, how to get patents from overseas, all kinds of things they did. But this MITI, and so in the book they say, well, a large reason for Japan's success as a was that it was a developmental state. It was not a free market economy where all these investors and capital was just, chasing different markets based on the free market principles. It was actually more of a command economy in the style of Soviet Union, where the state guided major companies. The companies, private sector and public sector, were very closely intertwined and helped with planning. Steel or shipbuilding, like auto industry, textile industry, as earlier cases. But in fact, there's a lot of stories where the private companies went against the government's suggestions, as you read in the book. So, or the state METI or whatever the state agency will advise in a bad way to private companies. And bad as in, eventually the outcome was something different from what they predicted or planned. Industrial planning is very, very difficult, right? You don't know how the world economy is going to be in 20 years. You don't know which technologies are going to be important. It's very difficult. Private capital find it very difficult to pinpoint the winning horse or the winning industry. How will bureaucrats be able to do that? Big question. They did state interventions through various financial policy, industrial policy, protectionism. We don't want to go into them. Bank of Japan, Ministry of Finance, they make it so that capital costs were kept low for large productive firms. Industrial policy, MITI control over allocation for exchange, all these kind of things. I don't want to go into it. And protectionism. Well, this probably is a very important element. That is, it was very difficult to get into the Japanese market as a foreign competitor because there are high tariffs, or relatively high tariffs, and non-tariff barriers. So it's very difficult to compete, say, as a textiles maker or shipbuilder, textiles mainly, plastics, construction. If you wanted to compete in Japan as a foreign company, there are all these barriers. This protected Japanese industries. Okay? So Japanese companies could sell to domestic consumers at a relatively high price, then they'll get high profits, then they can reinvest that, and then they can be competitive, and then they sell at a lower price overseas. Agriculture, obviously, but a lot of heavy industries as well were protected and nurtured using tariffs and using various ways to prevent them from coming in. Okay? Industrial policy failures. So this is the examples of how the METI or the government said you should do this, but in fact it was bad advice. In the book they talk about it. Car companies like Toyota, Nissan, Isuzu, Mazda, Mitsubishi, which are very big car companies now. Some of them owned by overseas companies. They were encouraged to merge. In the US, they had 2-3 big auto companies, and the Japanese officials thought, we have too many auto companies, let's merge them. And they encouraged merging. The companies refused, right? And today we have the mainstay or the main drivers of Japan's economy is auto. And thanks to the fact that they didn't merge, well, who knows what would have happened, they would have made a super company, but it was better that they didn't merge in the short run. Honda, for example, was discouraged to go into car making at that time by the government. But they eventually became world-class car makers. Sony, another very successful company, had trouble getting a license, permission to make transistors. You need to have license, you need to have approval from the government to make certain products at that time. And in the beginning it was very difficult for them to get approval. If they managed at the end, but obviously this is an example of government officials not knowing the potential of a company. Sony became a world-class company, Toyota, Carmaker became a big world-class company. So there are some examples. It's not very good to argue from example because I have this anecdote, I have this story. We have to talk in terms of the net effect, but I think the idea of an omnipotent, that is all-powerful, all-capable, all-knowing bureaucracy guiding an economy, this may be a caricature, to growth is a faulty vision. And it's only one element of the post-war economic miracle. Okay? Sleepy? Some people already sleeping? Very good. I haven't lost everybody. Maybe about 5% sleep rate. That's acceptable loss ratio, 5%. Okay. Let's talk then about its impact on society. Any questions so far? Pretty non-controversial arguments I'm giving. But if there's anything you don't understand or you want to challenge, fine. What kind of impact did it have on the town? Key, I would say, is this urbanization and creation of a so-called middle-class society, where everybody thinks and perceives that they're part of this mass consumer, mass equal society. But first, urbanization. All of these new industries, new trade, new service, transport, new jobs in urban areas, populations of these big urban centers, for example, the Kanto region, they doubled almost this time. Urban population goes from 38% to 76%. Those who live in urban areas doubles, and it's been going up ever since. Very quickly. And it's not just Japan, obviously all over the world. You have this rapid urbanization. At one point, I don't know, some news story 3-4 years ago, there are more people living in cities than in the countryside now, all over the world. And estimates that 70, 80, 90% of people will be living in cities. This is a very big change in how people have lived for thousands of years. Cities used to be exclusive, only for certain people allowed to live, but now most everybody lives in cities. Large metropolitan areas, and then you have new suburbs around them, and then industrial cities along the Pacific belt, so-called Hokkaido, and then down to Fukuoka, where the Shinkansen goes from Tokyo Station all the way to Hakata. That's the Pacific belt. All along there became the central areas for development, industrialization, factories, urban. And it sucked in the population from the rest of Japan to the Pacific, mainly. And these things, of course, result in lots of problems, urban problems, which we'll talk about in more detail next week or next week. Problems of housing, problems of overcrowding, problems of pollution, and also problems of all these urban workers who are cut away from their traditional communities, may have left the rural areas, and now they have nobody that will take care of them. There's no traditional means of welfare. So they have to create new public services. They need to create old care homes, more hospitals. They need to create nurseries, much more welfare services, because all these people are now taken away from traditional rural villages where everybody helped each other. Now they're individual families, nuclear families. They don't have much support, so they need the support of the state. This is not a problem, but there's a lot of tensions in that process. So urbanization brings about problems. Kaso and Kamitsu dynamic. Kamitsu is overcrowding. And of course you have problems in the rural areas because of depopulation. And this we'll talk about in more detail in another class, but what's happening in rural areas? There's so fewer and fewer people. And it already starts this period in the high growth era. Urbanization, Toshi Jinko, Chiho Jinko, okay, 1950 to 2050. Just keeps on going up. And the rural population goes down, urban population goes up. Here, what's happening in rural areas? Well, mechanization means higher productivity, so you need fewer farmhands. The number of full-time farm households shrinks from 2 million to 830,000 by 1970. Part-time farming expands. So a lot of farmers, they work on the farms only part-time because they don't need to be there all the time, and then the rest they go to a nearby town or work in a factory, or they go dekasegi, which which is to go to the city and work for 3-4 months or 6 months, and come back when the farming period is busy, so they can help their grandparents or whatever. Okay, and this was made possible because you have infrastructure connecting the countryside and the urban areas. Much more infrastructure. Highways, roads, train systems, and of course the Shinkansen, 1964. Is it 1964? The first Shinkansen? Maybe it was 1960. Anyway, around that time. Around the time of the Tokyo Olympics, 1964. Shinkansen is wonderful. It's one of the most wonderful things about Japan. I love it. I take it every week. Never have I been in an accident. Never has anybody been in an accident. Nobody has died from a faulty train accident, Shinkansen accident. Amazing. Every day, 5 minutes. If you want to be proud about something about Japan, you should be proud about Shinkansen. Anyhow, it's great, but also because it makes, places so close, people get sucked out of the rural areas, and it's easier to, move about. And higher mobility doesn't necessarily mean everybody living equally spread out. It means higher mobility means people live where it's more convenient. So you go to the bigger cities, and then when you need to, you go to the rural areas. Yeah. Higher mobility also means, for example, if you make a bridge across, let's say, an island in Shikoku to Hondo, right? Shikoku has the island. Make a bridge. People used to do their shopping and everything in the island, but now they can just go to Osaka on the bridge. So this area that was connected now has less economic activity. It's strange. Mobility has a straw effect. And this results in a lot of population loss, Shikoku, Nihon Kaigawa, so northern Japan, northwest Japan, and also on this side, Toyama, Fukui, Ishikawa, all these places suffer population loss. Not only because of the jobs being in the cities, opportunities being in the cities, there's more mobility to move about. Okay, so that's a change in terms of rural and urban. Finally, how about in terms of the perception of people? That's the problem with this kind of course. You can't talk about everything, so you have to sort of pick and choose. I'm giving you a very simple and biased slices from this period, but we've seen how it changed economic activity, it changed structure of the population. How about in terms of the psyche, the mindset change? Well, the book has a very good summary of this, and very good discussion of what is called standardization of life ways, hyojunka. And before, people had very different kinds of streams of life, different kinds of experiences, but in the post-war period, from work to education to family life, many more people were sharing similar kinds of experiences. Okay? Hyojunka. Workplace, pre-war and even earlier, people had different kinds of, there are farmers, there are craftsmen, there are people who did family businesses, some bureaucrats, some white collar workers, but in the post-war, many more people were salaried than had family-based jobs. Right? They were no longer just a small individual household, individual family operations. Now, most people were working as salaried employees. Not everybody, but quite a lot of people. More and more salaried employees outside of their home, outside of their immediate family. Education, public education already was quite extensive in the pre-war, but this accelerates. Number of people who go to high school from 50% in the 50s to 93% by 1970. Now it's probably 99%, 98% of people go to high school. And the people who go to university also increase up to 35% by 1975, almost a third of the population, which is very high compared to, say, US or OUS, same as US, higher than Europe says. But I know that tertiary education, university education, rates of attendance very high in Japan. And not only that, there's equal access to universities. Okay, so there's a chart in the book you should look at which shows that those from poor families, those from very rich families, the chances of going to universities is almost the same. Same in terms of the population, their population proportion. Okay? So there was no bias. Just because you're from a rich family doesn't mean necessarily that you'll go more likely to a university. And there's no bias if you're from a poor family, it doesn't mean that you won't go to university, which was the case in, say, Europe, I'd say UK. It's always been like that, very difficult to get into university, depending on your background. This, of course, has changed in recent years thanks to Kaksa Shakai. More and more families cannot afford to send kids to university. Or chances of those who go to the top universities tend to be from the high-income families. But we'll talk about that in another section. But in this period, education was becoming universal. Most people went through elementary school, junior high, high school, oftentimes university. Similar kind of curriculum, similar kind of experience all over Japan, regardless of your background. And also, many more families have become nuclear. What's a nuclear family? Not the Kim family. What's a nuclear family?
Is the family that consists only the parents and the children?
Yes, with no grandparents or no relatives. Traditionally, you'd live with your grandparents, great-grandparents, maybe some relatives, but in the post-war period, nuclear. And of course, this is a similar situation in Europe, similar in the US, I'd say. But more and more families tend to be just nuclear, or an increasing number of households are single member, so no children, just yourself. And this figure is probably much higher today. And then people are not having arranged marriages, people are having romantic marriages. The point of these details is that a majority, not everybody, but a majority of people are sharing similar kinds of experiences. Okay? And standardization of life ways. Which leads to this idea of and of course we have to talk about salaries and income levels. The inequality in terms of income has come down very quickly in the post-war period, steadily coming down, so-called Gini coefficient. I think I have a figure somewhere there. So everybody is not only having similar experiences in work and family and in education, but also their income. And if you have similar income, you buy the same kind of things, right? So there isn't this gap. And what this leads to is this perception. Perception is more than nothing. Perception. What's perception in Japanese? Shiten. Kenkai. 認識。自分が一億総中流社会の一員であるという認識。Perception. You see yourself as a member of this big mass society. And the phrase used was 一億総中流, which is 100 million people are middle class. 100 million was about the population of Japan at the time. Idea is we're all middle class. Of course, this is not true at all. I mean, in reality, you have 5-10% very wealthy landowners who have lots of assets, and then you have 10% very poor. But on average, much more flatter society than in other Anglo-Saxon societies, for example. And this manga, anime, is called Sazae-san, which is a comic that began in the 1940s and then animation in 1969. It idealized this kind of standardized lifestyle, standardized family. Although this is not standard in that it's not a nuclear family. It has, what's his name? Namihei and anyway, the grandma and grandma lived there. So it's a bit different, but the kind of things that happen in the family and the stories, and it's aired on mass television, everybody watches and feels, oh yeah, we have this in our family as well. It relates, and it also generates this notion that we're all kind of in the same fat middle class lifestyle experience. Yeah? You're interesting, so we all talk about watch mass TV and news. So it's also another important element compared to today. Media was so much more mass, right? It wasn't so fragmented. There wasn't the internet. There wasn't Facebook and feeds. If you wanted to be entertained, you watch TV, and there were only 4 or 5 channels, so most people watch the same things. So the perception of yourself as a member of this bigger society much stronger. Okay, that's income inequality. The Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality in a society, distribution of wealth. 1 will be perfect inequality and 0 will be perfect equality. And you can see that it's come down. It jumped up a little bit during the oil crisis, comes down. And then it's gone up since about the 80s, accelerates under Koizumi, has been going up all over the world. Piketty and the age of capital going up, which is a big problem everywhere, but in Japan as well. But in Japan, comparatively, very, very equal society even today in terms of differences in income and differences in assets, ownership of assets. Yet, despite this notion of a 100 million middle class society, there are divisions in society, continued divisions. Let me just check the time. Okay, we still have lots of time. There's still some ongoing divisions. What kind of divisions were there? Let's throw it into class. Throw it over to class. I talked about all this standardization, lifeways, inequality going down. People have notion that they're part of the middle class. What were the differences that endured, that remained in society post-war period, this period? Somebody? Yes? Huh?
Gender.
Gender, very good. So what kind of gender differences? What kind of differences between gender, apart from the fact that genders, I mean, men and women are different gender, but yeah, go on.
For women, once they became married or something,
I can't hear you. You have to
once they
be.
got married,
Yeah.
that they were not necessarily forced to quit, but they couldn't really go much higher in the position.
Good. So we're talking about the work opportunities and work experience between men and women were continue to be different. That is, women tended to, first of all, have different kinds of jobs when on entry after graduating from university or whatever. Maybe they would not be on the career track. So there will be clerical positions. And oftentimes, even if they entered in the same way as men, when they got married, or, God forbid, have children, then they'll have to oftentimes quit. They couldn't continue. So, inequality in that sense. Also in terms of general income, the gender divide in terms of income between men and women is still wide, quite wide. Any other differences that, I mean, they come out in the slides, but we have 30 minutes so far before falling asleep. Yes?
It's more than inequality defined between men and women in period. We also immigrants and
Immigrants and
he
Hinin, okay. So, so race or nationality issues, differences between those who have Japanese background or those who have come from overseas or who have second generation Chinese or Korean, oftentimes, because most of the foreigners in Japan were second generation or first generation Chinese or Koreans. That kind of, there was a divide and all kinds of discrimination towards them. Also, outcast groups, all these kind of groups that were, although formally, and the Constitution, you can't discriminate, and there was a lot of laws passed and a lot of movement against discrimination. It continued unofficially in terms of hiring practice. Like companies will discriminate against a certain candidate because they'll check whether his background, where does he come from? Does he come from this outcast group? Or in marriage, maybe you don't want to get married to families who have oppose a marriage to somebody from such a background. And they'll check the address. You can tell a little bit from the address of where you come from. Or they'll do a background check. So discrimination, racism, and discrimination against certain groups of people. Yes, indeed. And these were, yeah. And any other divides? Would you say differences? That is, not everybody was equal or sharing an equal mindset or perception of being part of this one happy Japanese family. We have gender, we have immigrants, we have what? We have, not immigrants, well, racial divides. Was everybody equally supportive of economic growth, development, modernization? Do you think? Everybody was on board, yes, my salary is going to grow double every 10 years. I can buy my TV, I can buy my car. Was everybody like, yeah, bravo consumerism, bravo material goods. Let's destroy the environment as fast as we can so we can buy all these things. No? Well, let's just look at the slides then. Continuing divisions in society. There was an economic underclass as well. Not everybody was hired in big companies or white-collar jobs. There are those who work for smaller and medium-sized workplaces or on contract jobs. Only this notion of everybody being a salaryman in Japan is a fiction. It's only a third or a quarter. Although people may be employees, they're not necessarily employees of these big companies. And if you're not an employee of a big company, one often didn't get all these benefits, including lifetime security, job security. There are also those, their salaries are poor. There's also an underclass of people, quite large one, who were who helped build Japan. Basically, they're construction workers. Many of them, day laborers, migrant. They would move around Japan looking for day, mainly in big urban areas. But these kind of people exist. This is a movie called Sanya. Sanya is an area in Tokyo near where's that? North of Ueno or somewhere, where all these flop houses, cheap hotels, where these day laborers will collect, and the day laborers will be there, and then they'll be picked up to work on a construction site. And this kind of culture exists. Of course, this is a very minority culture, but there are groups that could not benefit from the overall growth. Gender. I don't have any picture of this, but women tend to get more likely to get short work contracts, not lifetime employment, or they'll get jobs that were low level, less responsibility, less management positions, and maybe discrimination towards advancement. Of course, officially, the Constitution says you can't discriminate, but in actual practices, there are all kinds of ways in which women tended to get less opportunity to advance, even though they may be equally skilled academically or in terms of their experiences. Of course, this was begun to be challenged to job discrimination in the mid-60s. Maybe beginning is misleading. There was a major case in which women challenged a company for not allowing them to continue after getting married and having children, not giving support. And to this day, of course, this is a big, big problem. Representation in politics and in top management, women, one of the worst in the world, basically. In terms of OECD, worst. It's like the ranking of women in parliament. Women is about 120 of them out of 150 countries, so it's very, very poor. Economically, in terms of careers, it's becoming less of a problem. But we'll talk about this. But already, or in the 50s and 60s, this problem hasn't been resolved, and there's building challenges against this and building conflict of the situation for women in the workplace and elsewhere, I could imagine, but mainly in the workplace. Ethnic and racial minorities. This is the number of Korean or South Korean, North Korean foreign residents in Japan. It's about 2 million in the peak, the 1940s. And then drops down after the war. So all of these Koreans from the peninsula, they've come to Japan, and Chinese as well. They came either voluntarily or involuntarily to work in Japan, have families. Some of them involuntarily to work for factories and cement companies. It's a historical problem. After the war, many of them went back. So that's why you see this sharp drop. But many of them also stayed. And they had children, and these became the second generation, third generation Korean and Chinese residents in Japan. Taiwanese too, a little bit. And these people faced persecution, discrimination in terms of job opportunities, maybe casual, everyday racism towards them. I mean, not everywhere, not all the time, and there are people who are fighting against it, Japanese fighting against it, but you have this kind of thing. And the book talks about it a little bit. So they were not a happy members. They were a bit outside of it. Right? And 2 million, I don't know, foreign population in Japan, foreign-born or foreign nationality, is about 1%, 1.5% throughout, gone up a little bit. So it's very small, but it's still important to know that there is that kind of minority. And this kind of casual, not racism, but because Japan is so homogeneous racially, everybody looks Japanese. If you go to London or Paris or anywhere, there's so many different kinds of races. You don't know who's a foreigner, who's not a foreigner. But in Japan, it's so obvious. Well, Chinese and Koreans is not obvious. You can't help it, right? I go to Shogaku to pick up my daughter, and then the kids are screaming, "Gaikokujin, gaikokujin!" I go, "Oh, Nihonjin, Nihonjin!" So it's kind of chuckles on there. But it can't be helped because to everybody it's the same looking. It's getting better, but anyhow. Burakumin outcast status eliminated. So we talked about the Kinin and Burakumin. Discrimination persisted. And there's a lot of struggle by those who support the rights of Burakumin, and they themselves trying to change policy, trying to get society in general to stop persecuting and discriminating and to respect their history and their culture. And the middle class themselves, those people who went through standard lifeways and got standard jobs and bought their standard TV and standard air conditioner and washing machine, they weren't all happy either. Not necessarily. It's funny. There were some groups who criticized this GNP-ism or GDP-ism. What is GDP-ism? Well, it's this idea that the most important thing in Japan and for everybody is for the economy to grow. Right? The assumption that everything will get better if we grow. At the cost of what? At the cost of nature, of the environment, pollution, at the cost of breaking traditional communities and ties, at the cost of, all the stress that is related to mass economic production and consumption, at the expense of social solidarity, local culture. So these kind of terms, Datsara and Ichioku Sohakushika, these were slogans or words that became popular in the mid-60s, 70s. The economy's been growing for 10, 15 years, and some people are critical. They don't think it's the solution. Ichioku Datsara means you want to quit being a salaryman. Datsu is to escape, and Sara is salaryman. So it's such an intense work culture. Of course, your job is secure for the rest of your life, but you can only do your job, and people want to get away from it. And the other, Ichioku, hakuchika means to become stupid, or to become kind of idiotic, imbecilic. The idea that all this mass culture, mass TV, mass consumption, making everybody the same, but also everybody stupid. Everybody less intense, less thoughtful. It's a kind of elitist view, but I think there's some truth. And not just in Japan, in many cultures, people deride or question mass consumption, mass growth, lowering standards, lowering culture. So, and it was not just, it was from, and this leads to a discussion next week about the political positions, those on the left, those on the right. The left, kakushinteki, kakushinha, those who wanted, well, in this cultural instance, the left value individuals more than the state. The individual is the most important thing, and individual freedoms and liberty. And on the right, the state, the nation, is most important. It's more important than individuals and tradition and culture. Both the left and the right criticized this mass culture and this middle class society. This is from Yoshimoto Takaki, who's an international poet. on the left, was quoted in the textbook. He says, Japan must feel continually increasing burden of a sensibility gripped with an amorphous sense of boredom, enjoying a bloated material life, relatively improved standard lighting, but an absolute empowerment. He uses a lot of big words, as some intellectuals do. But the main thing he's seeing is people are getting richer materially, but mentally and culturally and spiritually, people are getting poor. Okay? On the right, you have a very similar kind of argument. This is, who is this? Mishima Yukio is wasn't he a Nobel Prize winner? Did he win the Nobel Prize for literature? That was Kawabata. But anyway, leading writer, a post-war writer. And he says, we have seen post-war Japan infatuated with economic prosperity, forgotten the root of our nation, lost our national spirit. We have seen post-war Japan corrupted by hypocrisy, spirit fallen into a vacuum. We watch the leaders entrust the nation's future to foreign countries. Of course, he's talking about Japan's U.S. security treaty arrangement. Hide our post-war humiliations that continue to stain us. We, Japan, he's ground our teeth watching ourselves defile our own history and traditions. So, very right position. This was part of the speech he wrote before he killed himself, or his speech that he wrote and spread out before, as you know, he famously cut open his stomach in Tokyo in 1970 at Ichigaya in front of the self-defense forces. And he had his head chopped off by a friend, which is quite scary. But anyhow, his statement is that, economic growth, post-war miracle, great. Well, he doesn't say great. He just says that it has made us lost our way and lost our traditions and roots, whatever that is, and it has made us not think about, our history, which to some extent might be true. And this strain, this mode of thinking continues to this day. The right-wingers in Japan tend to criticize post-war Japan as being an aberration and not really thinking about all the benefits that economic growth actually brought. Because there's tremendous amounts of it. People are living longer lives, healthier lives, less insecurity. Japanese population grew. All these things could be arguably good things. But those on the left and the right both are not fully satisfied with this economic miracle. Are they representative of the general public? Probably not. I think the general public is pretty happy that they can buy their new TV and buy their new car. But I think there's also mixed feelings. People are complicated. They like the growth and they like the economic security, but they also miss out on something. Either on both these arguments on the left and the right. Okay? So, what time is it now? 15 minutes? 10 minutes? 10 minutes, good. So any questions up to here? Of the overview of this period? Yes, ma'am.
So what do you think that makes China, Japan, and Malaysia similar
Say that again?
So what do you think that make China, Japan, and Korea and other countries share the same or similar economic pattern of growth?
Okay, so in the chart there was this 10% surge for Korea and China and Japan. Because they happen in different periods of history, so the international context is a bit different. I don't know, maybe there is an economic stage for countries when you reach a certain stage of investments and technological accumulation, R&D accumulation. It takes off if you have the right ingredients, educated workforce, surplus population, but with political stability, right? You had in Korea and China, Japan, political stability. Different kinds of stability. Japan, you had a political stability based on one party being dominant. China, you have, in a democratic system, China, you have, of course, controlled economy, very stable politically because of no democracy. Korea also, I guess it wasn't really a democracy at that time, political stability. Extra population, I don't know. Investment, these countries, China and Korea, they got a lot of help from Japan and other countries in terms of capital investments and technological know-how. So I think all three of them are a bit different, but similar patterns like that. I don't know. It's hard to say. I'm not an economist, so I can't really answer. Anybody have a good answer as to why a country can sustain 10% growth for 10, 15 years? What are the things that they share? Yes?
One thing that if you have low capital at the beginning.
Right.
I don't know. Was that what you said?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
after the
so-
war bombed out, you don't have enough infrastructure.
Yeah. For example, right now in developed countries, so it is really, I don't know, they don't have any higher than 2%, 3%, and it is really high to sustain after that, after being kind of satisfied with the capital.
Sure. So that's the stage part. That is, one has to invest and expand in terms of capital expenditures and infrastructure building and whatnot. If you're a developing country, Japan wasn't really a developing country, but it was bombed out. You need to invest, and that helps very high growth. And at a certain point, it's kind of saturated, so it slows down. So all the Western countries now, they all share similar 2-3% growth, right? Or less. So the interesting thing is, after the Lehman shock, all these countries were saying we're becoming like Japan, slow growth, deflation, we're having even contraction of the population. So there are patterns that you could see. Probably China in 10 years or so will maybe hit that similar saturation point, and then already, right, it's getting slowing, the economy. GDP is 7, 8%, 6%. Maybe 10, 15 years will reach 2-3%. Similar problems that Japan experienced. Korea probably has hit the wall too. Asian financial, but I'm not an authority on these economies, so I can't really say. Any other questions? No? No? Okay. Well, anybody read Mishima? No? No? You don't read Mishima in your high school textbook or something? Kinkakuji? You just read a little part, right? You don't read the whole book. That's what I find interesting in Japanese education. You only read like highlight. You don't read the whole book. There's no point in many things. Well, no point, but you have to try and read all the whole book. At least fiction, I think. Anyhow, so is it meaningful to call the high growth era a miracle? What was so miraculous about all these things I said? Anybody? Answer the first question.
I think maybe.
Yes, of course.
For miracle, I think if we define miracle as having something very good after a long term of desperation.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think it is miraculous. So everybody kind of like and having a good living standards and
Right.
peace. So it is in that sense, it kind of is miraculous.
Yeah, it depends on how you define miracle.
Yeah.
If you think miracle is just a situation in which things get better after a really bad time, then miracle's happening all the time because life is up and down. But if you more broader definition of miracle, we said that very unlikely, very improbable, and also very rare, and not able. You can't really explain it, right? It's like a miracle. It's God did it, kind of. Then it's not a very useful term. You think? What do you think? Yes.
I think that the growth is kind of remarkable in a sense, but also I think it has a lot of like special historical context for Japan. For example, it was during the post-war period, so that Japan can just restart everything from zero and like rebuild almost every aspect of this economy. So I feel like it has a reason.
It was a very lucky, and all these international and domestic reasons came together at the same time. A very lucky kind of combination. That may be miraculous in a sense. But of course, one could argue that it was not inevitable, this situation, that there could have been decisions taken by the government or by the occupation authorities which may have prevented this from happening, right? Going back to creating political stability. If they didn't give all this land to the farmers and create a stable agricultural population, maybe there would have been political turmoil, then there might have been, repression, and then fight back, and then maybe civil war in Japan, maybe not that bad, but instability and turmoil. If they hadn't set the US dollar Japan yen rate at 360 yen at that time, maybe exporting industry would have not have been as strong. I don't know. All kinds of things you can argue historically, counterfactually. So I don't think it was inevitable, but it was certainly a combination of very good things at the same time, and then some good decisions taken. I don't know if it's a very satisfying answer. Question 2. Whose interests were best or least served by this high growth era? Well, we didn't really discuss so much who are the winners and losers, but who would you say were the greatest winners of this high growth? How do you answer such a strange question?
Corporations.
Yeah, well, first we have to ask what about this question. Who were the winners of this historical period? When somebody asks you that kind of weird question, what do you say? Huh?
Japan is all.
No, the question itself is whose interests were best, least. Come on, be more critical. Yes.
Was it like in economical sense? So the exporters really benefited from this high growth there.
Yeah. You have to ask in what sense. What do you mean by best or worst? What do you mean by kachigumi, makigumi, right? You can't answer a question without understanding what the question is asking. So in an economic sense, yes, perhaps exporters or corporations, majority of white-collar workers in big companies, they benefited with growing salaries and growing spending power, consumer goods, right? But how about environmentally? A lot of areas lost. I mean, we didn't really talk about in detail, but damaged by pollution, or damaged by a lot of infrastructure built, so pristine nature built over all these bridges and dams. Rivers were blocked up all over Japan. All these other things. It depends on what perspective you mean by best or worst, best or least successful or interesting. Okay? But overall, generally speaking, one would say that Japanese public, the majority of them benefited quite a lot from economic growth, although there are misgivings. The problem we have today of shrinking population and aging, very high aging, this could also be traced back maybe to this period. Right? Economy is growing very well. People are very stable, secure. And people are living longer lives so that they can live on. Well, people in 50s, 60s, they're now 70, 80, 90. If the period was not so successful economically, we would have probably not a similar kind of demographic situation. Anyhow, there's lots of ways of answering this question. But when you want to answer such a question, you have to try and analyze. What do you mean? What do you mean by winner? What do you mean by loser? Wait. Any other points? No.
I have a short question. May this high growth area might be one of the factors that the politically powerful parties to be more prevalent over time? I guess it is LDP during
Yes.
this process too.
Good. Well, that's what we're talking about in 2 weeks' time. We're talking about how did the political system respond or interact with this period. And certainly the reason why the LDP is in power for so long was partly because they oversaw this period of strong growth, which kept most people happy. So it's a very good point. And the fact that they still stay in power today is a hangover, leftover to some degree of their success 20, 30 years. Not only that, but quite a lot of it. So it's a historical legacy. Okay. The end. Next week, you must read chapter 15. So 2 weeks from now, chapter 15. Okay? And the week of, I guess we have 2, yeah. We meet again on May 10th, today? May 10th? And May 17th, I'm not here, I'm in Sweden, so we'll have no class. So I'll send you an email of Q4. But we'll do an extra class at the end of the semester. Wait, if you borrowed the book last week and didn't bring it back, please bring it back. I don't think I got Rachel Young. Okay. If you want to borrow a book, please come up. There's 2 books you can borrow.